okay? But there is also this sort of middle area. So we start to see that there's an incredible amount of overlap between these various structures. It isn't straightforward. And I think that a lot of times people, when they first encounter Gioacchino's work, they want it to be very, very straightforward. The first age is from Adam to Christ, and then, it ends with Christ. And so now there's something new. And so the second age is going to start with the Son, and it's going to go up to, something just in the future. And then there's going to be this glorious third age, and that's going to last to the end of the world. But the ages actually overlap each other. And that's why we see these rings as interlocked. One of the reasons that I like this image of the rings so much is I think about the mathematical structure of the Borromean rings. In the Borromean rings, if you remove any one of those rings, the other two are unlinked. The other two are independent of each other. That the linkage of the three comes from not the linkage of all three somehow integrally, but in the linkage of pairs, that each of the pairs are linked. And I think that Joachim is very, very sensitive to this, that Gioacchino is very, very sensitive to this in drawing these structures of these rings. A note real quickly about the colors. Here we see the color of the green for the age of the Father, the blue for the age of the Son, the red for the age of the Spirit. It varies wildly. He does not seem to have any consistent structure for the colors. And I read a paper a couple of years ago where somebody was looking at this and trying to ascribe to Gioacchino all kinds of interesting sort of color symbolism, which works great if you're only looking at this one, but you look at any of the other Trinitarian circles and the colors are all different.
Just whichever colored pencil you picked up first?
It seems to be that simple, yes. The idea of Gioacchino with colored pencils is sort of, stuck with me now forever. But thank you very much for that. So we've got a series of interlocking states. And that's one of the things that I find most challenging in trying to figure out what it is that Gioacchino's really talking about, because these don't seem to be stable. These don't seem to be consistent, one text from another. There seems to be a certain degree of variation, a little bit of give and take. There is actually, Matthias, if you would go back to the very first. Yeah. Obviously, it is very, very similar to this structure that we see in the Expositio in Apocalypsum, which is a much earlier work. This is from the Paris manuscript. But we see the same kind of structure. So we see the primary status, the secondary status, the third tertiary status, Pater, Filius, Spiritus Sanctus, but again, Pater, Spiritus Sanctus, Filius, Spiritus Sanctus, and the four-part structure here. So he seems to have at least retained this. I have to admit there is something that puzzles me, and if one of you who's perhaps more schooled in Latin than I am, figure out what is it that he identifies in this centerpiece here. And this is always, he seems to be very intent on making sure that this is properly labeled, properly marked. But I've not been able to figure out what it is. It seems to be, and it would make a certain amount of sense that this is the intertestamental period. But I have to admit that I am at a loss. And unfortunately, Dr. Reeves and Dr. McGinn don't seem to be a great deal of help on this. But that may entirely be my failure. That may be that I've not found the appropriate reference. So if anyone can sort of figure this one out, I'd be grateful. If you would skip forward, yeah, that's the one I want. This, I think, which is from the Liber Concordiae, right? Yeah, okay. This is the one from the Liber Concordiae. I think what we're most meant to take away from this is that individual figures within the particular status are sort of mirroring the movement of the status itself. That we're again talking wheels within wheels. We're looking at macrocosms and microcosms, that we're seeing played out in particular figures, many of the same things that we're going to see played out in a grand scale.
You know what that immediately makes me think of is have you ever seen frequency diagrams where they talk about octaves? So you'll have the frequency go across the horizontal, but then you'll have the frequency doubles, and it will go across the horizontal, and those points where they cross.
They match up at specific points, yeah. And I think that, I mean, if Gioacchino were to have this sort of language of frequency, that this is something that I think would be very, very consonant with the kind of work here. That we are talking about sort of an increase in octave, where it's, you know, Adam isn't Josiah. That's not what he's saying. You know, Christ isn't Benedict. That's not what he's saying. It's not a matter of equation so much as it is one of concordance, that they connect with each other and they refer back and forth to each other. And we can gain a deeper understanding of the text by looking at the various concords. But we oughtn't to simply say that things are happening on a simple one-by-one basis. So the image of frequency, I think, is one that is very much in keeping with what he's doing here. Let's look now at the dragon. And this beautiful, beautiful drawing of the Dracos Magnus et Rufus, the great and red dragon from Apocalypse 12, with 7 heads and 10 horns. And the interpretation that these represent individual kings, individual powers, comes straight from the text itself. But the identification of one of the heads with some particular ruler has varied wildly. Again, some have seen this as something that has occurred entirely in the past. Some have seen this as something that is going to come in the future. Gioacchino appears to have split the difference, as it were. That he looks at the first 4 heads, and the first 4 are identified with specific rulers who have persecuted the church. Interestingly, he says that the 5th one is one that is going to be from within the church itself. And I have to see if I think I made the mistake of not marking off my, oh no, there it is. So of the 5th head, he writes, Quintus isci primus in partibus occiduus cepit fatigare ecclesia. So it'll put on the clothes of it'll bear the markings of the church. Later on, obquam causum multis schismata. Okay, I guess we know what that is all about. Et tribulationes orta sunt ex eo tempore in ecclesia Dei. So this is somebody who's going to cause schism from within the church. That this is not going to be a power outside of the church that is going to persecute it, but something that's going to come from within. And the last 2, 6 and 7, are still yet to come. There is a strong prophetic dimension in the ordinary sense of the word as foreseeing what's going to come. Father Tony?
So he says that the 3rd age will not be marked by a New Testament or a new revelation.
That's correct.
And yet here he is making revelatory type prediction.
Because for him, this is an interpretation of the New Testament, not a 3rd Testament. So he's not Joseph Smith, for example, right? I mean, he's not saying that he's going to have a New Testament of Jesus Christ. But instead, this is purely interpretive. And that's where I think he would make the difference.
For specification on the 5th head, the one coming from within the church, that is someone that at the time of his writing he was expecting to appear? Or?
It's unclear.
Okay.
He's, and later Joachimists, as they're called, were split on this. Some identified it with one of the innocents. I can't remember which one. That the fifth head was actually Pope Innocent.
One of the less innocent of the innocents?
I think clearly one of the less innocent of the innocents. Or it could have been one of the less pious of the piouses, or less honorable of the Honoriae, or whatever.
The less frank of the Francises? Oh, there's only one Francis?
There's only one Francis, and so far he seems to be quite frank. Yeah, it's unclear whether he's writing about somebody who is within the church at the time. Obviously, that's a good way to become a crispy critter. Or he's looking for somebody that's coming down the road. That's unclear. That's unclear.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to figure that out from my reading as well.
Yeah.
I mean, my immediate suggestion is possibly Arius, but I have no foundation.
Timing would be odd.
Timing is off there.
Timing is
Yeah.
off, yeah.
And
Luther, right, but.
and they're that's anachronistic.
Yeah.
It does seem to be. I've seen many suggestions that he is referring to a specific pope.
Okay.
And it would therefore make sense that he would be somewhat circumspect in identifying, because as is the case with so many heretics, he sees himself as a good son of the church. He doesn't see himself as doing anything heretical. In his mind,
Just like Arius.
I'm sorry, just like Arius, like Galileo,
Yeah.
like I mean,
Nestorius.
Nestorius, I mean, Origen, I mean, they all, sort of see themselves as representing the true tradition. So I don't think he wants to strike out at the church. He's not a revolutionary in that sense. And he doesn't seem to suggest that that monasticism is going to replace the priesthood. That's not what's going on here. He's not anti-clerical in that sense. He is a priest himself, after all.
Right.
Well, let's not kid ourselves. But he does see something coming down the pipe that is going to be significantly different.
My history's crap, so how far are we from Luther?
It's another couple hundred years at least.
250
Yeah,
years.
another 200, 300 years.
I'm just, the Reformation was a response to what was happening in the church, right?
Yeah.
So maybe he's talking about what was happening in the church at the time.
It may very well be. I mean, and certainly the Reformation is not something that happened, on this day.
Capuya.
It's not far from the Great Schism.
It's about 100 years after the Great Schism? 200 years. No, he's born in 1135.
Oh, sorry.
So he's born just 80 years after the Great Schism. He doesn't seem to. That doesn't seem to be rich on his mind. I hadn't thought of that before, because I don't know that he mentions it. I mean, he doesn't think of the Eastern Church as somehow a threat to the Western Church at this point.
On the other hand, if it is what he meant, he'd be very circumstanced about talking about it.
Yeah, and I think that maybe within the first couple of hundred years of the Great Schism, there was certainly hope for reconciliation. So maybe he didn't want to, say anything that would be that politically dangerous in an age when reconciliation was still a possibility. So, again, in many cases, we're left without clear signposts here. So the 6th and 7th heads, and finally the tail representing Gog, are still yet to come. So he does have a prophetic plan, a prophetic work that he is undertaking here. There are other images. I didn't include them. After we break, if you want to take a look at this wonderful text from Marjorie Reeves called the Figure, it has the images of the 10-string psaltery. It's another one. So a musical instrument with 10 strings that he draws on. That there are, as I said, the trees, the tree circles, the tree eagles. There are a couple of eagles that become very, very important because the Johannite aspect is something that comes to the fore in his work. And I do want to talk about that in a little bit as well. The third status is obviously the one that is going to be of the most interest to us. That the third age is the one in which we're really talking about something new emerging, that we are looking forward to, something that is a possibility. It is, as we said, monastic. That, of course, raises the question of what happens to the institutional church in this age. Does it go away? Does it transform? Is it overthrown? But there does seem to be a move from flesh to spirit. And this is very much in keeping with the kind of historical analysis that's going to be done by people like Hegel, that sees history as a constant unfolding of spirit coming to knowledge of itself, coming to its own understanding. But this transformation, this move, comes only with severe ordeals and trials. And this is very much in keeping with more contemporary to us, apocalypticism that sees the apocalypse primarily in terms of a final battle, a final struggle, with a peace that precedes it. There is a real distinction from previous forms of theology of history, and I'm thinking primarily of Augustine here, in that there doesn't seem to be any attempt to recover the past. Jules, can I have one of the cups? I managed to bring myself up an entire pitcher of water and not a cup. And ordinarily, of course, I would just drink straight from the pitcher, but seeing as we're on video, we'll avoid that.
At least a straw.
I need a golden tube. We'll talk about that. Is different from other forms of theology of history in that it is not an attempt to recover or understand the past so much as it is completely forward-looking. It is monastic, but he's neither trying to found a new monastic order or even to identify his own order as the sort of start of the new monasticism of the Third Age. But rather, it is something new that cannot be fully envisaged. It's something that cannot be fully sort of pictured even now, sitting as we are in the 12th century, looking forward to the development of this new monasticism. But there does seem to be a profound meliorism. Meliorism is the idea that it is individual human beings that somehow contribute to the movement of history and the movement of theology that we see outlined in the Bible. I talk about this in my classes sometimes in the context of Zoroastrianism, talking about Manichaeanism, for example, in terms of St. Augustine. That the ordinary way of thinking about the final consummation of history in Christianity is to say, we know how this is going to end. We know how this is going to play out. We know who's going to win. The white hats are going to win every single time. And there's no way that it could be otherwise. That St. Michael and his angels are going to be victorious over the beast, and the New Jerusalem is going to come down, and there will be no more tears, and so on and so forth. There's no way that that cannot happen. And so this is a good incentive to be on the side of the angels, as it were, because you know what side of the bread your butter's on. On the other hand, if the conclusion of the struggle is up in the air a little more, if there is a possibility that the beast could be victorious, in the first place, that's sort of terrifying. The idea that God could lose this battle. Now, if we think of God as the creator of all things, the devil and the beast, these are necessarily creatures. These are things that by their very nature are going to be inferior to the creator from which they spring, so they could never be victorious. But if we're talking about forces that are more closely matched, there is the possibility that they could win. And if that's the case, then we have, I think, an even better reason to be on the side of the angels, because our actions actually contribute to God's victory. That God, in some sense, needs us to be victorious. We've got to fight on his side. And it seems that Gioacchino was clearly more in line with a kind of meliorism where human activity plays a decisive role in the unfolding of historical and spiritual and cosmic events. That the defeat of the dragon, the defeat of the beast, comes because human beings take certain actions. And this is very, very important if we're going to see in history playing out of cosmic and spiritual themes. Because ultimately, history is shaped by the actions of human beings. These are individuals. It's not as if there are, there's those of us sort of sitting down here doing our thing, and then there are these huge impersonal figures that somehow are running on autopilot. And I think that I'm influenced by Hegel in thinking this, that history only happens in and through individual actions. At the same time, the providential movement of history is such that they conform to a certain kind of pattern. That there is a real tension between a sort of free action on the part of individuals and the necessary progression of the age. Again, I like to think of this, and I'm talking about things like fate. That to say that we have a fate is not to say that everything we do is predetermined. And the simplest way to do this, to think about this, is to imagine that next year we get together at Conclave, and His Eminence gets up in front of everyone assembled and says, well, everybody, I have to tell you that Marthomas is dead. And when the applause dies down, naturally, one would ask how this happened. What brought this about? How could this possibly be the state of affairs? And there's two different answers that you could give to why is it that Marthomas is lying in a grave rather than talking about Gioacchino da Fiore this year. One answer is, he got run over by a truck, or, he had a tumor the size of an egg in his head, or, Juliana finally got tired and set the bed on fire, or, whatever it is that's, is the immediate sort of efficient cause of my demise. But another answer is that Marthomas, and this is not to be circulated, of course, is human. And human beings die. And how we get to that death, how we get to that fate, is not predetermined. It's not as if there's somehow a necessary playing out of events that leads us to that point, but we will reach that point inevitably. No matter what choices I make, they all ultimately lead to that same place. And so I think you can see that same sort of tension in looking at the movement of history, and that history does have a providential nature to it. It unfolds according to certain kinds of patterns, and yet those patterns are driven by the actions of individual human beings. That it isn't that we are simply powerless in the face of history, that we take a real part in shaping history. Lastly, there is the figure of what he calls the spiritual pope. That there is a figure that will emerge in history that is going to assume the pontificate, but not in the manner in which we've come to expect in the Second Age. Not in the manner in which we've come to expect in the age that's typified by the priesthood, but rather a spiritual pope that will embody or personify the Third Age. And when I was sort of giving that initial description, where it goes from Benedict to somebody, That somebody there is the figure of the spiritual pope. And so the very end of the Third Age goes from the emergence of the spiritual pope to the consummation of the age. So why is any of this important for us? Now, at this point, I haven't said anything radical. I haven't said anything that you can't find in Dr. McGinn or Dr. Reeves' books. I haven't said anything particularly radical or interesting. But I want to, because I want to make a claim that's going to get me into all kinds of trouble. That Gioacchino da Fiore is a great, big, fat Gnostic. Marjorie Reeves is currently crawling out of her tomb to come throttle me right now for saying this. Gioacchino da Fiore has strong Gnostic tendencies. And the Gnosticism, I think we can look to certain elements and see real Gnostic echoes in what he's doing. First of all, the idea that we are on a path that leads from an age of the world to an age of the spirit. That the movement is beyond the world, that the focus is beyond the world in which he finds himself. And this played out in his own life, and there are comments from his secretary, who says that when he began his work, he was stunned to see a person of such notoriety, a person who was famous. It was a bit of an ecclesiastical celebrity sitting in rags. That he didn't have the kind of regard for the world that was very much a part of the church at this time. That he's looking beyond the institutional structures of the world that define the church at this time to something that we can identify simply as more spiritual. The emphasis on personal mystical experience as a way to guide interpretation of canonical texts is something that he shares with the classical Gnostics. That it's not that we simply abandon these texts, that we say, oh, well, those belong to the exoteric church, and we're somehow better than that. But rather, our insight coming from discipline, coming from spiritual practice, enables us to provide an interpretation of these texts that plumbs their depths, that goes beyond simply the surface meaning. Not even just to allegorical or moral interpretations. Certainly, traditional theology has done that perfectly well. But to something much more profound, much deeper, and a kind of anagogic or heavenly interpretation. There is this strong sense that he is not of this world, that he feels alienated in this world, and that the attempt then is to return to a state that is transcendent. And the exclusion that he feels, I think, mirrors some of the exclusion that we talk about in the Johannine communities. Again, we're thinking of Raymond Brown. That kind of exclusion, that kind of separating out, I think can be seen on a number of levels in Gioacchino's work. First of all, very simply, the sort of exclusion of, or the decentering of the monastic life in favor of priesthood. And this is something that, and we can see this even today, unfortunately, within the Roman Catholic Church, that the emphasis is very much on the priestly hierarchy. Oh yeah, and then there are those monks and nuns that are somewhere out there, and they're doing their thing too. That they're relegated to a sort of extraneous position. And I think that this is something that Gioacchino feels very, very acutely. But lastly, this sense that he wants to escape this world. that he's looking to an age that is going to be beyond anything that we experience today. And that, I think, is the reason that